Morning, guys. So, I have been thinking about making this video for weeks and weeks. I have been ruminating on the stuff that I'm going to talk about today for years. And what really sort of flipped the switch was I went down a weird rabbit hole on YouTube of videos about 2025 and sort of pessimistic or even dystopian versions of what we're going through right now, or interpretations of what we're going through right now, particularly in the US. And in these videos, again and again, people kept saying something is different in 2025, but they kept saying it really started to change, depending on who you're talking to, between maybe 2019 and 2021. So I think, as with a lot of things in human history, we don't tend to look back far enough. I would agree that there has been a huge shift in the past 4 to 5 years that was tied in with the pandemic and a lot of other things. But I don't actually think that that shift was substantive so much as it was a shift of us realizing that these trends that had been going on at an accelerating rate for much longer had finally gotten to a point of inevitability, of inviability, where we're really past the point of no return in a lot of ways. And I know that probably sounds really vague, and just stick around. I promise you I will very quickly get into the meat and potatoes. But that is what led me to make this video, was seeing all these videos and feeling like, yeah, people are talking about wealth inequality, right? They're talking about how the stock market is posting record highs while we're talking about a K-shaped recovery where people in the vanishing middle class and lower are actually getting worse off. There's all this talk about about a mental health crisis that we absolutely have. And not only are these things drivers of the problems that we're facing, but I see them as reflections of it and as symptoms. And I think if we don't look at them in that sense, we only learn a little bit of what we can learn from them. I think if I were to say it in a really brief way, we have been, as humans, as humanity as a whole, we've been barking up the wrong tree probably since not very far into the Industrial Revolution. And if you guys haven't seen my previous videos, I'm a science teacher. I studied biology for years of my life, so I'm not saying that I'm like a doctoral level expert, but I have spent a long time thinking about humanity's evolutionary roots, learning about human physiology and psychology and what makes us happy and promote self-actualization. And that's what I want to talk about today, because again, I think the people who are saying that there was this fundamental paradigm shift in the past 5 years are just sort of misestimating the time period, that really the changes came far before, and we're just realizing it finally in these past few years. So one of the things that helped me develop the thoughts that I'm talking about in this video was an article that I read, and it talked about how by studying, when anthropologists go to modern hunter-gatherer civilizations that have had minimal contact with outside civilizations, and when archaeologists study the archaeological record to try to get a sense of how these primitive tribal societies lived, when they estimate how much time during times of relative stability these societies had, how much time the average person had, say, in the average week to do basically whatever they wanted with their time, I was shocked to read that it was something on the order of 20 to 25 hours. So like taking care of food and shelter and child rearing and community duties basically took the rest of the time, but your average individual had like 20 to 25 hours a week in one of these quote unquote primitive societies to like cave paint or go on a spirit quest, or go eat some plant with interesting effects, or just like date and make friends and enjoy life. So the article that I'm talking about made the point that we have so many time-saving inventions that are costly and that were sold to us as efficiency increasers. The vacuum is a great example. It really helped shorten the time that you need to clean certain surfaces. But the problem was that along with that, we started living, particularly in the West and in the US more than any other country probably, we started living in much, much bigger domiciles. So yeah, a vacuum can save you time, but it's not going to save you time if your house gets huge and you have to upkeep the interior and the exterior. On top of that, it's kind of a similar deal with dishwashers and, washing machines for clothes, other laundry machines, drying machines. Like it only works if you're not massively increasing the number of things that you have to use it on. And we have increased the number of things that we have to use these devices on so disproportionately that not only have they not saved us time, but we are underwater as far as the amount of free time we have goes. I don't know about you guys, but I grew up in like white bread suburban America, and my parents both worked full-time jobs. And by the time they came home from work, my mom made dinner, you know, she took care of all of the things that she had to do that she wasn't paid to do during the day at work. She probably didn't have more than 30 or 45 minutes, like my entire life from when I became conscious of forming memories to when I was out the door for college. I don't think she had more than like 45 minutes free on any given day, or if she did, it was like a holiday or something very, very special, and weekends, same deal. The amount of upkeep that goes into your average American suburban house is unbelievable. That in itself is almost a full-time job, and we are forced to fit that in with errands on the weekend. We're forced to fit that in with taking care of our health and everything else. And what happens is that like this is a model that was sold to us as viable, the nuclear family in a nice suburban house that looks beautiful, which is not viable at all. It's not viable economically. It's not viable in terms of doing a good job raising your kids while also having both parents work full-time, which is increasingly necessary in the economy that we have in the US over the past 20 years. So I'm going to touch on that again later, but I was just shocked when I read this article. It really made me stop to think like, wow, 20 to 25 free hours a week. I don't know anyone, even single people my age or younger, who have that much free time, because again, our weekends are basically spoken for before they even begin. So that was one of the first things that got me on the track, the sort of thinking track that I'm going to talk about today. So there was another article that helped coalesce what I was with this first article sort of like awoke in me. And that was an article that my friend Rose sent me, and it was called Maslow Among the Siksika, who were the Blackfoot people, okay, so indigenous Americans. And Maslow, if you don't know of him, you probably have heard of him most famously through the hierarchy of needs. He's a psychologist and sociologist who studied human motivation, organizational structure in civilizations, and he talked about how there was this pyramid, and that at the base of the pyramid were some relatively essential needs like food, shelter. After that came certain relationships, and then after that finally came self-actualization, came becoming the best that you can be in every area of your development. Okay, so now there are exceptions to that, to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People have noted incredible resilience, community, and transcendence in, for example, people in concentration camps during the Holocaust. So I'm not talking about Maslow's hierarchy and saying that that's the end-all be-all, but what was interesting was that he spent a summer among the Blackfoot in 1938, and this writer who is presenting this view of Maslow's work thinks that this had really shifted how he thought about human motivation and human society more broadly, I should say, because like he had gone into it thinking that human civilization essentially represented an individualistic struggle of some people getting domination over others in economics, politics, and every other area where you can gain. What happened when he came to this tribal society was he saw a very low level of inequality. He saw a very strong community. He saw children who were raised not in a very strict disciplinarian way, but in a very permissive way. He saw a society that practiced restorative justice, where someone who is regarded as quote unquote deviant would have that label removed if they changed their behavior. There was no like sort of permanent marking of that person as wrong or damaged. And again, there's some debate over whether everything that Maslow saw in the Blackfoot was actually there, or whether he sort of idealized some of it as well. However, he said, and this was his direct conclusion, about 80 to 90% of the Siksika have a level of self-esteem that is present in only 5 to 10% of the Western populations that he was studying. Now, Maslow is not the only person who has come to this conclusion, okay? So there's a book that I think everyone should read for a bottom-up history of the United States, and it's called A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Now, Zinn is very careful not to romanticize or glorify earlier societies because he talks about how brutal they could be, how difficult life was before modern medicine and other modern conveniences. However, he does point out very notably that the Native American tribes who lived in the area of upstate New York that I'm from, so the Syracuse area, they were called the Iroquois. The county that I live in, Onondaga, actually means, I think, people of the hills, and there was an Iroquois confederacy, a group of tribes that was very strong that operated around here at the time and for hundreds of years before white settlers came in. And what he noted among the Iroquois was that they had a really good thing going, basically. They had a really tight community that was every bit of life, from like gathering food to sort of pursuing spiritual development, was woven into community, and all of that happened along with the 4-season rhythm of the land around here. This is not an easy place to survive in upstate New York. Like when the Dutch and British settlers first got up as far as upstate New York, if somebody arrived with an army, say the Dutch were ousting the British from Albany or whatever happened, they would very often, the settlers there would say, we're not fighting for this, just take it, you know? So not an easy place to make a living, as biologists say, in terms of getting food and shelter that supports you. But the Iroquois did such a good job of it that Maslow was Zinn, someone who was talking about civilizational development like all around the world, was impressed by them. You know, he was impressed by, again, just the rhythm of it. And sorry guys, had to have a little change of venue, but Zinn was really impressed by the Iroquois, by the way that they provided for themselves stably against a pretty harsh environment, the way that they in particular prepared for the winter and lived through the winter in their characteristic longhouse shelters, but also just the level of satisfaction and spiritual development that they had. So this idea that I think we all know that this idea that civilization has been pure progress is, it has been totally shredded by the past 20 years at least of human society sort of starting to fall apart. And this is not just in the West. Many of the problems I'm talking about today are most acutely seen in the West, but this is definitely a global phenomenon at this point. And when you consider the way that we've all been sort of tied together, particularly following the Industrial Revolution, that makes sense. So we have become, in a certain sense, in my opinion, we've become imprisoned. We're living this modern life that looks so shiny and that gives us so many sort of diversions and excesses, but we're so far away from our evolutionary roots that it just doesn't give us what we need to truly be content and to truly develop ourselves to the best that we can be. So as hard as it is to accept, most of us probably do better spending more of our time meeting our basic needs, crucially, together. One of the key differences between modern Western society and those tribal societies that I've just been mentioning is the focus on like sort of what I call terminal individualism in modern Western societies in particular. Like those earlier societies had true, strong communities, something that I don't think anyone would say that we have in modern America. And that is one of the key shifts that has led to the decline and the degradation that I'm talking about now. So as I was talking about, so again, it's difficult to look at the way we live and say, yeah, I want to spend more time, planting and raising my food and hunting. I want to spend more time building my own shelter. Like, not having to do that for ourselves is such a convenience in some ways. But when we talk about where the time that has been freed up goes to, it's gone to killing ourselves largely and making ourselves stressed and miserable. So I'm going to talk more about that now. But the key thing too, and the reason I mentioned that earlier article about the amount of free time that tribal societies tend to have, is that we're not talking about filling up all the time. In fact, as I talked about with the way my parents live and the way that pretty much any, hardworking American lives these days, more freedom, more flexibility, and more choice in where we spend time is actually, I think, one of the most important things that we need to free up in order to reverse the trends that I'm talking about and avoid a truly worst case dystopian scenario, okay? So again, I don't think anyone would deny that our community has completely been degraded over, I would say, even the past 50 years. There's a phenomenal book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, who is a sociologist at Harvard, and he uses bowling leagues as an example of how American community has declined over the past several decades precipitously, about how participation in community organizations like volunteering at hospitals and volunteering at schools and just, like neighborhood sports leagues and things like that, about neighborhood barbecues and getting to know everyone in your neighborhood in a friendly way and supporting people when there's a fire, like how all of that has just really, again, precipitously fallen off in the past decades. And Bowling Alone came out, I want to say it was like maybe even like 2008 or 2010. And everything mentioned in it has gotten worse since then. The rise of smartphones and digital technology has sort of intensified all the trends toward social isolation, as have the economic problems that we're all very aware of, with the collapse of the middle class, the increasing inability of average Americans just to fund a decent, stable lifestyle. So really recommend checking out Bowling Alone if you're interested in what has contributed to the decline in community, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. So again, we're talking about like modern Western individualistic society and contrasting it with earlier societies, or even some modern Eastern societies that have an idea of community as no one left behind. And I think that that's so important, because as we're seeing with homeless people, as we're seeing with mass shooters, we are hugely influenced by the people that we let go astray, the people who we push away and keep away. Like, society as a whole cannot afford to ignore them, and we are finally seeing those chickens come home to roost in the US in the most deadly, awful way. And it's not going to get better unless we address the underlying failure of what I would call a tribal sense of community, which should prevent that in every case in which it's preventable. And I'm not saying every case is preventable, but in my opinion, most are. So again, talking about wealth inequality, we're talking about people who are born in middle class or lower socioeconomic ranks have less and less opportunity to advance, no matter how much work they put in. They also have less and less freedom to take some time off, to decompress. I think about my Uncle Dan, who is a lawyer, and how I think it was between college and law school, he said this is a very 60s thing, maybe a 70s thing in his case, but it was very much go find yourself. So he got on his motorcycle and he rode all over the country for a few weeks or months. And there's so little opportunity, again, mostly because of economic changes, but also a lot of other reasons. There's so little opportunity to go like have an adventure, to go camp out in the woods Walden style for a few months, to just get to completely sort of refrain from the game of organized civilization as we learn it growing up, for long enough for us to decompress, reevaluate, and see where we really want to go with things. And I would argue, and I think almost everyone would accept, that has been a huge detriment to human development, and it has pushed people into mental illness and some of the other things that I'm going to talk about shortly here. So yeah, we've also got, as I talked about in a previous video, we've got executive orders that are criminalizing homelessness, even for people who are essentially travelers who aren't causing trouble. So we've got less and less opportunity if you don't fit into the very rigid, very organized type of society that we have in the modern West. We've got less and less opportunity to do your own thing. Now, there are exceptions. There are, for example, YouTube personalities who have figured out their own little niche, and I don't ever want to say it's not possible to find something that works for you, but it is so goddamn hard. It has never been as hard as it is now, if you go against the grain of modern American society, to find a way to support yourself unless you're born independently wealthy, so that you can do something that works better for you. And again, that plays into everything I'm going to talk about right now. So what we have now is what I would call a state of collective human zoochosis. Zoochosis is when you take an intelligent animal, and anything from a primate to a great cat to it doesn't even really have to be that advanced of an animal, but you put them in a small, confined environment where they are removed from the kind of freedom and context that they evolved in, and they quite simply go crazy. you know? So they will attack each other. Aggression becomes the rule, even when it's not aggression that would be natural, meaning sort of like explained aggression, you know, based on dominance hierarchies or based on needing to get food or something like that, right? So aggression goes way up. You see that sexual behavior, and this relates to certain crimes we have going on in the U.S. these days too. Sexual behavior gets very compulsive and just very like dark and unending, because the animals are trying to just get that dopamine going, and they sort of get addicted to it, right? And again, it's a response to being just sort of unhealthily confined. You get animals scratching themselves. You get animals that can't sleep. They're pacing for days and days, and it's painful to see. If you're a zookeeper or any kind of worker in this environment and you see an intelligent animal in this kind of environment, you can oftentimes, people will say, you look in their eyes, and even across species, you can see like they're saying like, let me free. Like they're saying help, you know? And I think, again, as nice as modern American society looks, we are at the help point now. We're at our own collective zoochosis. We have rates of anxiety and depression that are astronomical. They are a reflection that a huge proportion of our population is not doing well. Addiction is another huge one. As I frequently say, we have lost 1 million people in the US to overdose alone, several times that to addiction generally. We've lost 1 million people alone to overdose since 2000, okay? So addiction is so tied in with everything else I'm talking about, because like if you're growing up in this straitjacket of a society and you're in a dysfunctional family unit that's been sold the lie of the modern conservative nuclear family rather than the village that has traditionally done a much better job collectively raising humanity's children, been sold that lie. You're going to a school that teaches you stuff you're not interested in learning, and you're forced to sit in these uncomfortable desks for 8 hours a day at a time when your body is telling you like, move, learn by moving, go do your own thing, you know, go on an adventure. If you're forced into these, you know, 9 to 5 that doesn't suit you, with a boss who's a jerk, in an economically exploitative arrangement that you can't get out of because you can't afford to lose health care. Drugs are, I would argue, many times even the most addictive drugs, for several years or even decades, they can be the best way to cope with that. You can't change the world around you in a big systemic way, but you can change how you perceive it massively. You can artificially boost your own dopamine very effectively for a very long time, but in the end, addiction is a lie. You'll need more and more. The side effects will get worse. You won't be able to function in society anymore, and you'll end up in jails, institutions, or dead, unless you're one of the lucky few who gets out of it before those endpoints. So the rise in addiction is probably, and the other mental health problems I've talked about, is probably the number one reflection of these changes that I'm talking about. Now, it's not just anxiety, depression, garden variety addiction that are on the rise. Eating disorders and all kinds of, I talk a lot on my blog about how basically I consider eating disorders, OCD, and addiction all different manifestations in the sense of their foci of the same underlying pathology. They're all about anxiety. They're all about ritual and obsession and compulsion. And along with the rise in addiction, we have rise in eating disorders. We have a rise in obsessive compulsive disorder with different foci, whether it's contamination, OCD, or something else. So we have huge indications that these are large chunks of society who are not just, not doing well, but they are not doing well enough that they are called mentally ill. We've got something like 20 to 25% of modern American adults are on a psych med. That is ridiculous. The fact that we look at this arrangement and say those people are mentally ill instead of our society is sick is a huge gaslighting and victim blaming. And just one quick thing, I'm all about, within these flawed systems, optimizing our own mental and physical health. We have to, in order to be well enough to change it. But after a certain point, and we're long past that point, I don't even think anyone on any part of the intellectual spectrum would argue with this. Past a certain point, we need to look at the systems themselves and say they're just not serving most of us most of the time anymore, and we need to change them or we're doomed. Oh, and along with OCD, again, I'm talking about those ruminative perseveration, anxiety-based disorders. We have things like trichotillomania, where people pull their own hair out, not head out. But yeah, so in I mentioned that one specifically because animals in zoos who are experiencing zoochosis will do exactly the same thing. They also get physical health problems that are fed by stress. They get weird rashes, they get autoimmune problems. Fast forward a little bit, and I'm going to talk about how in humanity we have the exact same medical problems going on right now. Okay, so I talked a little bit about how you see a rise in aggressive crime, violent crime, and most disturbingly of all, sex crimes among humans, because again, we are trained by modern society, by modern technology, by modern food, by modern media. We're trained to seek that quick dopamine hit as the inoculation against the total sort of unsatisfactory existence that we have. We have been sold that that's a solution because the people at our top of society, at the top of our society, make incredible money off of consumer spending. It's like 2/3 of the U.S. economy is driven by consumer spending, which is why the billionaires are so concerned with the declining birth rate, even though they're not willing to, give living wages to help combat the decline. But anyway, yeah, so we have like a situation where we've got crimes that are geared around like getting a quick hit of dopamine and that kind of thing. It always becomes addictive. This can happen with it's, I'm not sure if it will hurt me to say the word on YouTube, but I'll just say like porn and all kinds of compulsive sexual behaviors. So like it really, we've gotten into a situation where we're seeking a relief from quick hits of dopamine that will only become addictive in itself and count against long-term self-actualization, long-term self-development and spiritual development. And so it's leading us further astray. These solutions that are supposed to help us are actually making things worse. We've also got like just this glorification of wealth and possession. We've got extreme decadence, what people have called the disease of more. I didn't mention this earlier, but when Maslow was among the Blackfoot, he noticed that they had this yearly ritual where they would all meet, and people who had accumulated excess possessions during that year would explain how they got them, and they would give them away. So the prestige of being wealthy in Blackfoot society was not from holding on to the extra things you had, but the prestige that came from giving them away to the rest of the tribe, to people who might need them more. Again, they had an extremely low level of wealth inequality relative to what we have today. So I should have mentioned that earlier, but yeah, just looping back to that, we have this extreme materialism in decadence, this disease of more. And it's not just our minds that are suffering. We have incredible levels of physical health problems. We've got extreme overweight and obesity. That in itself is a potentially civilization collapsing, I would argue, civilization collapsing medical phenomenon that we have ongoing right now, okay? We've got a lot of other diseases, though, that on their surface, you might think, how are they related to what this guy is saying? But they're tied into the underlying stress, into the civilizational and technological development that I'm talking about. Development, right? So, for example, autoimmunity. We are seeing a profusion of autoimmune diseases of every single system, as well as multi-system autoimmune diseases like lupus in Western humankind, right? A lot of that probably comes from the fact that we've made ourselves bubble babies. Our environments are too clean. We're not getting out in the natural world enough anymore. And because of that, when our immune system is finally stimulated, it's underprepared and it overreacts. And when it overreacts, it ends up targeting our own tissues. So autoimmunity is a good example of a direct tie between modern, Western, cleanly, industrialized life and major medical problems that can drastically shorten or end your life. We also know that we have accumulated all kinds of really alarming toxic chemicals in our environment, which can cause cancer. We've got, sort of xenoestrogens from plastics and other materials, which can influence human hormonal development and development of sex, secondary sex characteristics, however you want to refer to it. We've also got, I watched this documentary about how there's a chemical, really long chemical name, but it's made in, very specifically, it's used rather in the production of Teflon. And this chemical has been found all over the world in literally every human population from the past, I forget how many years, but let's say the past 20 to 30 years. I believe they had to go back to blood samples from American soldiers shipping out to what would have been Vietnam in the 60s. They had to go back to those blood samples to find blood samples without evidence of this chemical that's used in the manufacture of Teflon in them. Now that is horrifying. I'm not saying that chemical itself at those levels is responsible for having a flipper baby or whatever, but like like the extent to which our dependence on modern technology, a lot of which either hurts average people or just benefits the people at the top, it's scary how much that has influenced our daily environments in ways that we can't possibly scientifically reckon with yet. So if I had to sort of summarize everything that I'm getting at with this video, it's that it's something like, that curve that we all see at some point, the stress performance curve, where certain amount of stress is good, it motivates you, it focuses you, your performance goes up on the y-axis. Then you hit a part of stress or a level of stress after which things quickly fall apart, right? Too much stress, you can't sleep anymore, you can't think anymore, and we all know what happens. You have a breakdown and you can no longer be functional, right? We're kind of experiencing something like that, except instead of stress versus performance, it's like the benefits of civilization versus the cost and the stress that comes with it, because humans are an inherently social species. No one's saying to we should all go live alone in small huts in the world, in the wilderness, right? But like the social contract has always come with some cons, but never so much so is now. I think that there's a point at which we needed modern healthcare in some form. We needed modern obstetrics and gynecology so that women weren't dying in 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 3 instances of labor, right? But we have gone so far past the point of optimal, like, I don't know what you want to call it, like civilizedness or optimal just sort of grouping together, and we're actually, because of that, losing a lot of the benefits. We're losing true community. Again, I think without I don't think many people would debate that at all. We're losing true community. Civilization is increasingly looking like we have a wage slave class and a billionaire class. That is certainly the trend. In some of these people, if you look up what Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and some of these other people have said, they've basically given away the game. They've said, you will own nothing and we will try to make you happy, or at least resolved to that. You'll have almost no freedom in your daily life and in, how you structure your time, but we'll try to make it a comfy little cage for you. And they've just given away the game, I think, because it's so far along that there's not much we can do, to resist it on certain levels. So again, this modern conservative nuclear family that Reagan pushed is an absolute lie. It's economically not viable. It's led to astronomical divorce rates of well over 50% in a lot of populations. It's led to latchkey kids. We did much better as a society that raised children collectively in tribal groups. You had to ask me where we started passing the optimal point on this curve of the benefits of civilization versus the costs. I would say it was probably somewhere between those tribal societies like the Iroquois that I mentioned and New England town hall democracy. I think probably somewhere in between there we hit the optimal point, although obviously it depends on when and where you're talking about and who exactly you are within that. But without question, I think we've gone way past the optimal point now, and we're at the point in the curve where things are falling apart. So my number one peeve with these 2025 dystopian videos is the ones that never talk about like what we can do, because all it does when you talk about the problems without possible solutions is all it does is feeds fatalism. It makes a dystopia a foregone conclusion, and it leeches your viewers. It leeches the urgency and the motivation that they have to do something about the problems that we're talking about. So I can't say whether this is reversible at this point, with the entrenched power structures that we have, but we have to at least try, right? And on a small scale, I believe it is. I believe, for example, we're going to have a return to positive tribalism. No one else is going to save it. Us, rather, the elites who run our government are certainly not going to do it. I think we're going to have, especially for economic reasons, we're going to have a return to intentional communities and communal living, which I think is a good thing. That life is going to look harder at first, but it is going to be so much more satisfying. And in those settings, we're going to have a return to true self-governance. I can't talk today, sorry, where we are not electing leaders who are a separate class. We're electing leaders who are in it with us, who are going to fail with us if the decisions that they're making cause us to go down. We're going to elect people who don't have so much more than us that they essentially just live totally, and they can afford to live totally separate lives. So I see a rise in that. I see a rise in, this homesteading movement, in raising our own food, in taking care of our health preventatively, because no human being was meant to live behind a desk for 9 hours a day drinking coffee. Of course our health is falling apart. We were meant to be out and active for almost all of our waking hours. So we're going to return to raising our own food, to hunting, to taking care of our health preventatively, and we're going to go back to a kind of true democratic self-governance, where we're making decisions a lot of the time by consensus, by temporary positions of leadership, where someone is a leader for a short term and then someone else in the community takes over, where we develop a healthy tribalism where no person can be left behind, because that's the person who is going to show up one day. And again, we are seeing the chickens come home to roost in the US right now, in terms of what happens when you ignore and when you push some marginalized or mentally unwell people further from society, ostracize them, and pretend that they don't exist. Like, none of us can afford to do that. It doesn't matter even what you think about that person. Like, there is a reckoning for that, and it's dangerous for all of us if we don't take care of it. So I know this video was a little bit spun out. I didn't want to script it. I didn't want to make it overly sort of prepared, because there are so many things that I wanted to link together, and I thought it would happen better organically than if I tried to create an arbitrary structure, which would have been insufficient anyway, again, because everything is so interconnected. So I hope that it was at least understandable, and I will put links to the pieces and books that I was discussing in the description of this video. If you have any thoughts on any of this, I would really appreciate you sharing them in the comment section, considering giving a like, and maybe hanging around the channel. So I love you guys. We will get through this somehow. And I think my goal for 2025 is to take the time that I would spend on the internet doom scrolling and to actually contribute to local community efforts that could potentially make the world better, which doom scrolling on the internet will never do. So, all right. See you next time, guys.